Ever feel like you're drowning in information?
Yeah.
All this new stuff coming at you, constantly research, theories, opinions. It's tough to figure out what really matters,
Yeah.
to really connect the dots.
That's where deep dives come in. That's what we're all about, right? We take a fascinating topic, something maybe a little mysterious, dive into all these different sources, and bring back the good stuff.
Real gems.
Exactly. And today we're diving into something pretty intriguing. It might even hit home for a lot of you.
I think it will.
You've probably heard about Lemuria, this lost continent, right?
Yeah.
It pops up in science, esoteric thought, even cultural stories. And then there's the Law of One, a philosophy that kind of reframes how we see reality and spirituality.
It definitely does, the raw material and all that, right?
Exactly. So we're going to see how these two ideas, Lemuria and the Law of One, might be connected. We dug into scholarly work on Lemuria, we looked at Wishar S. Survey's perspective, and of course, the wisdom from Ra in the Law of One.
And where are we going with all this?
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to see if these different viewpoints can give us a fresh perspective on early Earth civilizations and some really big spiritual principles.
Sign me up. Okay, so where do we even begin with Lemuria? I mean, where does this whole idea come from?
It's a pretty interesting origin story. It all started with a scientific puzzle back in the 1800s. This zoologist, Philip Sclater, was studying lemurs. You know those cute primates, right?
Yeah, Madagascar.
Yeah, Madagascar. But here's the thing, they also have related species in India and Southeast Asia.
Oh, interesting.
So Sclater was trying to figure out how they got so spread out, and in 1864, he proposed this idea. What if there was a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean, which he called Lemuria, named after the lemurs, of course?
Clever.
This continent, he thought, could have been like a land bridge connecting those areas, and bam, that's how the lemurs migrated.
Makes sense.
So you see, it started as a simple explanation for this geographical mystery, pretty far from lost civilizations and magical energies, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But like many good ideas, this one took on a life of its own.
Oh, yeah, things rarely stay simple, do they?
Not at all. Around 1870, this German biologist, Ernst Haeckel, a big fan of Darwin, picked up Sclater's idea. Now, he was all about evolution. So he took this Lemuria idea and said, wait a minute, what if this wasn't just a path for animals? What if it was the actual birthplace of humanity?
Wow, that's a big leap.
Huge leap. He thought humans first evolved from, our ape-like ancestors right there on Lemuria.
So a scientific theory about animal migration kind of accidentally created a whole myth about human origins.
Exactly. It's a good example of how scientific ideas can be, reinterpreted in powerful ways.
Fascinating. And wasn't the whole scientific world kind of buzzing with discoveries back then?
Oh, absolutely. Paleoscientists were finding evidence of huge changes in Earth's past. They came up with names like Gondwana land for these massive ancient continents. They were theorizing about land bridges connecting continents now separated by oceans.
Wow, sounds like a pretty exciting time for science.
It was. And all this talk of lost worlds and ancient land masses, it really fueled people's imaginations. It provided this kind of, scientific backdrop for ideas like Lemuria to take root.
So we've got these two paths emerging. On one hand, you have scientists focused on actual evidence, like fossils and extinctions,
Yeah.
a kind of disenchanted catastrophism, right? And on the other, a more imaginative, maybe even magical interpretation of Lemuria.
That's a brilliant way to put it. You hit the nail on the head. And this magical interpretation, it really took off in certain circles.
I bet.
Yeah, Helena Blavatsky, a founder of Theosophy, she really embraced the idea of Lemuria. In her book, Isis Unveiled, she describes it as this great lost continent south of Asia, stretching from India to Tasmania. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
She connects Lemuria to Atlantis, and she introduces this concept of root races. She says Lemuria was home to the third root race, an important stage in humanity's spiritual and evolutionary journey.
So it's not just a submerged landmass anymore. Now it's tied to this whole spiritual and evolutionary narrative.
Exactly. A radical departure from Sclater's original idea.
Yeah, no kidding. And it doesn't stop there, right?
No, not at all. The idea of Lemuria has had a pretty incredible life, popping up in all sorts of unexpected places.
I can imagine.
Take the New Age movement, for example. Figures like Ramtha, channeled by J.Z. Knight, They claim to have lived in Lemuria tens of thousands of years ago. They describe it as this advanced civilization that eventually sought refuge in Atlantis before it sank.
Wow, that's wild.
It is. And then you have people like Gertrude Norris Meeker. In the mid-20th century, she actually wrote to the U.S. State Department claiming that a group of islands off Panama was the government of Atlantis and Lemuria. She believed they were the last remnants of these lost continents.
That's a whole other level of belief.
Oh.
So we've gone from a scientific idea about animal migration to a New Age utopia, to a self-proclaimed government. That's quite a range.
Isn't it? And then there's the Tamil perspective, which adds another fascinating layer to this whole thing.
I don't know much about that.
Well, in Tamil Nadu, India, Lemuria became intertwined with their myth of Kumarikandam, their lost homeland.
Interesting.
They envision it as this golden age of Tamil civilization full of culture and knowledge that was tragically destroyed by Katalkal, meaning ocean seizure.
Sounds devastating.
It was. It's not just flooding. In Tamil tradition, Katalkal represents this catastrophic event, almost a divine act that wiped out an entire era. The loss of Kumarikandam is a deeply felt cultural trauma for them.
So it's more than just a lost land. It's a symbol of lost heritage.
Exactly. And for Tamil placemakers, it became a powerful narrative. They used it to argue that Tamilians are perhaps the most ancient people and that their language is primordial.
Wow, that's quite a claim.
It is. They even drew on scientific concepts like Lemuria, Gondwana land, and land bridges to support their claims about Kumarikandam, even while holding on to their traditional accounts of its destruction.
It's almost like they're blending science and myth to create this powerful story of their origins.
It's a fascinating example of how different cultures adapt and reinterpret ideas to fit their own narratives. And maps play a role in all this too, from scientists mapping ancient land masses to more imaginative depictions in occult and Tamil traditions. They're all trying to visually represent this lost continent, almost like claiming it for their own story.
Maps as a way to connect to the past, to make it real. Fascinating.
It is.
Okay, so we've journeyed through this whole idea of Lemuria, from a scientific theory to a spiritual homeland and cultural touchstone. Now let's switch gears and talk about the Law of One.
Sounds good to me.
For those who might be new to this, what's the main idea behind the Law of One?
Well, the Law of One, as channeled through the entity Ra starting in 1981, it essentially says that everything in creation is interconnected. It emphasizes this idea of unity.
Okay, so interconnectedness and unity.
Yeah. The core concept is that the entire universe is, at its heart, a single being. And everything within it, including us, is linked through what they call the one infinite creator.
So it's like a giant web connecting everything.
That's a good way to put it. And within this framework, the Law of One talks about these densities of consciousness. Think of them like stages in our spiritual evolution.
Okay, stages.
It starts at the first density, which is the realm of basic elements like minerals, and it goes all the way up to the seventh density, which is like a gateway to the next cycle of evolution.
And where do we fit into all of this?
We're currently in the third density. It's where we learn and grow through our experiences, where we develop our capacity for love and understanding.
And what about harvestability? I've heard that term before.
Yeah, so at the end of a big evolutionary cycle, entities in the third density can graduate or be harvested into the fourth density.
Kind of like leveling up in a video game.
In a way, yes. But this transition depends on a couple of things. First, your overall orientation. Are you more service to others or service to self? And second, your level of conscious awareness.
Okay, service to others, service to self, and awareness. Got it. Now, what about these wanderers? They sound intriguing.
Wanderers are beings from higher densities, like the fourth, fifth, or sixth. They choose to incarnate into third density bodies like ours to help with planetary evolution.
Wow, so they come here to help us. That's pretty selfless.
It is. But there's a catch. They undergo this forgetting process, which blocks their memories of their higher origins and abilities.
So they're kind of like undercover agents for good.
Exactly. And their mission is to act as catalysts, to subtly nudge and awaken the consciousness of those around them.
And catalyst refers to the experiences we have, right? Good and bad.
Exactly. It's all the stuff life throws at us, the challenges, the opportunities. They force us to examine our beliefs, make choices, and ultimately evolve spiritually.
Okay, so we've laid out the basics of both Lemuria and the Law of One. Now the big question, how might they be connected?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And to be clear, Ra doesn't actually mention Lemuria specifically in the Law of One, right?
You're right, he doesn't. So any connection is based on our interpretation, on seeing potential overlaps and thematic resonances.
So it's more about reading between the lines.
Exactly. Now, Lemuria is often portrayed as an early Earth civilization, which our survey, for example, says it sank about 12,000 years ago.
That's a long time ago.
It is. So it's possible that Lemurian society, if it existed back then, might have been influenced by what the Law of One calls Confederation teachings.
Confederation teachings.
Remember, the Confederation is that group of service to others beings that Ra belongs to. They've supposedly interacted with Earth throughout its history.
Right, right. So maybe the Lemurians encountered these teachings.
It's a possibility, and the way Lemuria is often described as this spiritually attuned utopia focused on intuition and connection to nature, it does align with some of the Law of One's core principles.
Yeah, it's like they were living in a way that was in harmony with the universe, with that interconnectedness that Ro talks about.
Exactly. Maybe they preserved a pure form of the Law of One teachings before they got distorted over time.
Makes sense.
Ra also talks about intelligent energy, this ability to manipulate energy, consciousness, and even nature through mental and spiritual means without technology.
Interesting.
And this idea resonates with those advanced abilities often attributed to Lemurians in esoteric and New Age circles.
Like they were more in tune with the planet's energy systems, maybe had abilities we've forgotten or lost touch with.
Precisely. And if Lemuria existed thousands of years ago, like survey suggests, it would have been around during those earlier cycles of Earth's development that Ra talks about.
But you mentioned that the Law of One teachings could get distorted. How would that apply to Lemuria, hypothetically speaking?
Well, the Law of One texts often talk about how teachings, no matter how pure they start, can get misinterpreted and watered down as they pass through generations and cultures. So even if Lemuria had these principles of unity and service, their understanding and implementation might have shifted over time. This could have led to imbalances and maybe even contributed to their downfall, as some accounts suggest.
Interesting to consider.
It is.
What about social memory complexes? Could a civilization like Lemuria, with its focus on spirituality, have reached that level of unified consciousness?
That's a great question. A social memory complex, according to the Law of One, is basically a state of group consciousness where individuals are so in sync that they function as one being.
Like a hive mind almost.
Kind of, yeah. They share memories, a unified understanding. Now, if Lemuria was as spiritually advanced as some believe, it's not impossible to think they might have been on their way to forming a social memory complex. Though, to be fair, the Law of One doesn't specifically say one way or another.
So there are definitely some fascinating connections to explore, but we should be careful about drawing definitive conclusions.
Absolutely, we have to be careful.
Where do these two ideas diverge? What are some things to keep in mind as we consider all of this?
First, remember that the concept of Lemuria is pretty complex. There are scientific theories, occult beliefs, cultural myths, New Age interpretations. They don't all agree, and not all of them fit neatly with the Law of One framework.
Right. The scientific Lemuria, the one about lemurs migrating, that's very different from the spiritual Lemuria described in Theosophy, or by those channeling Ramtha.
Exactly. And let's be honest, there's no hard scientific proof that Lemuria existed as this physical lost continent, at least not in a way that directly links it to the Law of One.
So we can't just assume Lemuria existed and that the Law of One is confirming it.
Right. It's more about exploring the possibilities, the thematic connections.
The resonance.
Yes, exactly. We also need to avoid creating a strict historical narrative that the Law of One itself doesn't support. It's tempting to connect the dots, but we have to respect both concepts and not force a connection where there isn't one.
Makes sense. And the Law of One really stresses personal growth, self-awareness, free will. How does that fit with these grand narratives of lost civilizations?
It's a good point. The Law of One emphasizes inner work, the choices we make on our individual spiritual journeys. Now, the idea of a super-evolved Lemurian society is fascinating, but we don't know for sure that they prioritize those same things. Some accounts focus more on societal structures or collective achievements.
So even if there are similarities, the emphasis might be different.
Right. It's up to each person to explore these ideas and come to their own conclusions.
And to wrap things up, we've explored the many faces of Lemuria, from its scientific beginnings to its cultural and esoteric significance. We've delved into the core principles of the Law of One, this idea of unity and spiritual evolution.
And we've considered the possible connections between them. Could a civilization like Lemuria have been influenced by Confederation teachings? Could their way of life reflect a pure understanding of the law of one's principles?
Those are big questions. And as we've said, it's crucial to be objective, to recognize that we don't have all the answers, and to respect the boundaries of each concept. This connection, it's more about thoughtful inference than concrete evidence.
It is.
And that brings us to a final thought. Maybe this fascination with lost civilizations, especially those believed to be spiritually advanced, reflects a deeper yearning within us,
A yearning.
a longing for a pure understanding of the universe, a desire to connect to something bigger than ourselves. Could that yearning echo the core message of the Law of One? This idea that we are all connected, all part of one creator.
That's a powerful question.
It is, and it's a question that each of us can ponder as we continue exploring these fascinating topics. We hope this deep dive has given you some new perspectives, some intriguing threads to follow on your own journey of understanding.
That's what it's all about.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.
See you then.